Hi, I'm Stephen Carson, coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Very happy to say that hopefully on my own for the last time for a little while. Just got word today from Ryan Turnipseed that he should be finishing up the class that was in conflict with the show and be rejoining next week. So I look forward to that. I don't know what it's seemed like from your guys' perspective, but from my point of view, it's been a little bit hard to do it on my own. I think I do better having a partner. It's been great to have Mad Mercenary and Ryan Turnipseed from the beginning of the show, one or the other of them as my co-hosts. So look forward to getting back to those days. Anyway, but I've got something for you today. The support for the show, which I super appreciate and am making use of. Don't know if you can tell, but I've got lights on me now. And anyway, all the tech is coming together here. Little tuning because you ought to be able to tell my jacket from the background. But anyway, need a little help from my producer on that. But anyway, that support is being put to good use, and it comes two primary ways. One is through Subscribestar, and the other is by donations of Bitcoin. And I don't know who donates the Bitcoin, but I do get Bitcoin donations, and I really, really appreciate them. They generally just don't even mention who they are or anything. I just see something appear in the wallet. So thank you for those donations. Really appreciate it, really helping. And with that, let me get right to it. I don't think I'm going to put anything on the screen. You're just going to be looking at me today, I think. In particular, the first thing I want to draw on, I'm just going to share a few things from it. It's actually a video. Everything, by the way, is in the video description. The links to Subscribestar and the Bitcoin wallet, as well as the links to the three sources I'm going to draw on today. I've been putting them in the live chat, and I realize that that's not working well because I forget. And anyway, so now I'm just going to try putting them in the video description. And as I said in the marketing, I'm going to draw on three sources in this order. Paul Gottfried, our friend Academic Agent, and Michael Rectenwald, who you might not be as familiar with. He is a really, well, anyway, I'll tell you more about him when we get to where I'm going to draw on his article, but I really recommend him to your attention. Okay, so what do I want to do here? This is, you could say, a corollary of what Academic Agent has been pushing for some time, which is that we don't believe in, all this grassroots change. We think it's pretty much astroturfed. It's actually worse than that, though. It's not even just fake grassroots change. It's just not grassroots change at all. And that's what I'm going to try to drive home today. I'm sure a lot of people are feeling really alarmed as they see some of the changes happening in the schools and the culture, online with censorship. It seems like things are happening very fast. People are like, wow, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we didn't have this, and this happening. And now it's like in our face and a big deal all the time. These changes are not natural and organic. I'll give it away. That's what I'm trying to tell you. These changes are not natural and organic. In particular, we need to look at the role of the state. Now, okay, we'll get to a comment from Paul Gottfried to give a little nuance to that. But I think it's really critical to look at the role of the state. So the first thing is a video from Paul Gottfried. He gave a lecture, the Murray Rothbard Memorial Lecture at the Mises Institute 6 years ago. And it's called Political Correctness is Political. And what he means by that is it's coming from the state. First, just a quick biographical note for those who are fans of Paul or Murray Rothbard. Rewatching this video, I was struck by some comments he made about Rothbard at the beginning that hadn't quite hit me before. It's funny because I think people who don't know much about Murray Rothbard, they just think, libertarian and he's a lawbird or something. If you listen to the beginning of this lecture, you'll note that Paul Gottfried was being pulled into what we now think of as like dissident right positions by Murray Rothbard. Okay, so Rothbard was already there, and he was bringing Gottfried in, right? Who we now think of as like, patron saint of the dissident right in some ways. Uh, so that's really worth your time, those first few minutes where he talks about that. In particular, what he says Rothbard influenced him on was seeing what Gottfried likes to call the administrative state clearly, as well as the hopelessness of the official conservative movement. Now, what I'm going to mostly skip today is the long record of wrongs, right? I'm not going to talk about what I think we all know, which is the changes that have been happening around us. They'll be hinted at to some degree, but in all three of these talks, there's some emphasis. There's just some telling of history of some of the changes that have been happening. I'm interested in why they're happening. I'm not going to focus so much on what the changes are. I think we all kind of know. So, in one part of the talk, Paul contrasts the protests of the anti-war protesters to the more recent protests like BLM protests and so forth. By the way, this was 6 years ago, so this was before the really dramatic BLM events after the death of George Floyd. But already there had been some, you might not remember, but there had been some BLM protests before that. And he contrasts what Academic Agent calls pushing at an open door, these protests that are clearly backed by all the big companies. They're all coming out in support of the protesters and so on and so forth. He talks about the contrast between that and what happened 60 years before, where the anti-war protesters, who he points out, had a reasonable cause, namely they were going to be drafted and coerced into being put into the meat grinder in Vietnam. So he says they did not have actually the institutions on their side by and large. You might remember Kent State, and there were other cases where the anti-war protesters were really opposed by the institutions of the day. And he says, but we're in a totally different world now. Well, what changed between now and then? Now quoting Paul, 60 years ago, we did not have a vast state apparatus fighting discrimination, judging hate crime and by implication hate speech, and monitoring the treatment of protected minorities. It's no surprise that establishment Republicans and so-called conservatives tiptoe around this fact. Those who live off of government patronage and from devising government policies are not likely to bite the hand that feeds, and the last thing I would expect them to do is notice the most powerful institution promoting political correctness. Okay, so what's Paul talking about here? This is not big brain idea abstraction here. Okay. I see a lot of this, and I've expressed dissatisfaction with it, partially under the influence of Paul Gottfried, that people will be like, well, we're in a terrible state, recently, in the last 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, whatever, maybe go a little bit further. We're in a terrible state. We see a lot of things we don't like. I think the problem is, Plato. I'm making fun of it a little bit. But I've been finding it dissatisfying when people decide to, look for the real root cause of the problems that are happening right now and go way, way back to, the problem is the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. Sure, there's roots in all these things probably that you could find, but I'd like to be a little more concrete and I'd like to name names. And point to things that are closer, in more proximity historically to the things that we're upset about, right? The changes that we're upset about. The vast state apparatus fighting discrimination, judging hate crimes and by implication hate speech, and monitoring the treatment of protected minorities. This wasn't established by the Protestant Reformation, okay? This was established since World War II, okay? What Paul's pointing to is something that's, historically speaking, really quite recent. And the impacts it has that we're experiencing are really quite recent, by and large. So these are, this is state power that is institutionalized. It is not just sort of an idea floating around. There are people, there are bureaucrats, deep state actors, if you want, bureaucrats who are sitting in offices whose job is to enforce rules, laws that have been made in relatively recent times. Okay. So, for example, with this anti-discrimination stuff, which, if you haven't noticed by now, is getting to the point of absurdity where, if you refer to a male to female transsexual as a man or use their old name, the anti-discrimination laws can be put into effect against you, right? So I think everyone notices that this stuff is having an effect at this point. If you'd somehow missed it before that, it's become really obvious. Well, how did the state put these things enforce this this new regime? Paul talks about how in the United States, if you admit a single student into a university and they get any form of federal funding, a federal loan or something like that, then the entire apparatus of anti-discrimination rules come into play and affect everything that happens at that university. Okay, so it's the nose of the camel problem, right? The nose of the camel in the tent. That's not the only thing they have. Some he was focused on universities to some degree in this talk. Some universities resisted nonetheless, and so the government just removed their tax exempt status as a way to try to bring them in line. This happened to an institution called Bob Jones University in the 1980s. Well, let me tell you, I know enough about university administrators. If they think something is going to threaten their financial interest, the financial interest of the university so fundamentally as losing their tax-exempt status, they're not going to get anywhere near it. They're going to bend over backwards to show what a good boy they are, to avoid even the whiff of a possibility of losing their tax-exempt status. And then what we've also seen against maybe not so much universities, but some political groups that the regime didn't like, is they'll, to use Paul's words, unchain the IRS attack dog to force compliance, right? So any federal funding, they've got you, and you're now under the control of, the anti-discrimination regime, which a lot of us think of as like political correctness or something, right? Well, it's laws and rules and bureaucrats, and these are how they come into play. So 3 mechanisms we can name. I'm sure we could go on, but just to give you the idea. You get a single student in there getting some federal funding. You're owned, right? They are now the piper who calls the tune, even though they're giving you $1,000 or something. They control everything suddenly. They can remove the tax exempt status from universities, churches, things like that. This has been something I've seen, by the way, in churches, in Christian discussions. People will talk about the dangers of having that tax exempt status because there are rules that go along with it. And some Christians have asked, is complying with these rules, does that mean that we're doing things that, we're not saying things that we should have been saying, right? I have feedback? Oh, okay. Oh dear. Sorry. Let me see if, I don't know why I would. I'm gonna have feedback. Let me try this. Okay, sorry. I just saw that. Okay, so. Okay, please tell me if my mic sounds better. Praise Keck. I'm wondering if I was getting a feedback loop of some sort. Yeah, anyway, please let me know if the sound is improved. I put in my headphones just in case somehow my mic was getting picked up. Okay, thank you. Okay, hopefully it wasn't horrible the whole time. Resonance. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I had my mic a little hot because it had been way too low when I did a test record, so I pulled it down a little bit. Hopefully that'll help. Okay, so yeah, so some Christians have suggested that churches should not have tax exempt status because it compromises what they their mission as a church to maybe say certain things. But they fear to say them because they'll lose their tax exempt status, right? So, the state kind of gets the churches over a barrel in that way. And there are, I think they're small in number, but there are some churches that actually don't do a tax exempt status for this reason, because they don't want to be compromised in their witness. And then there's the, going after people with the IRS and auditing, and there's so many rules. The IRS, and there's many other agencies where they can go after you and make your life a living hell, and there's so many rules. Everyone's breaking a law all the time because there's just too many rules to possibly know about all of them. So if the state decides to target you because you're not going along with, their agenda, including a cultural agenda, then they can decide to find some rule you're breaking that you couldn't possibly have known about, right? Okay, so let me bring a little nuance. I'm going to continue to expand on this story of the state as a key actor in changing the culture, in bringing about censorship, and in bringing about a number of these changes that many of us are not happy with. Here's a little nuance from Paul. He was not an anarchist like Murray Rothbard and like myself. He is not an anarchist, I should say. He's still alive. He says, my point, near the end of the talk, my point is not that every attack originates with the state. And this is an important distinction, and actually Academic Agent in the next item here makes the same point. It is rather that every cultural threat is made much, much worse because of state intervention. The state does not contribute to this problem in a half-hearted fashion. Concerned administrators and progressive judges are morally committed to their mission of fighting discrimination and freedom. Although the state sponsorship of political correctness may not be the only reason for its existence, it should be the starting point for those seeking to understand it. Okay, so always dangerous to use metaphors, but I'm going to throw one out here, or analogies. I'm going to suggest that the way to understand this is that the state is an amplifier. Okay, so in Academic Agent's talk, he talks about interests, special interests or whatever, right? An interest comes along, it comes to the state, it gets its agenda put into law. The Supreme Court, as he emphasizes, just legislates from the bench and just changes everything for everybody, just like that. But that's because there had already been a concerted effort by some interest, to move things in a certain direction culturally, right? So another way of putting this is that, and I'm sorry, I'm almost quoting someone, I'm forgetting who it was, but someone was just saying, oh yeah, I know, Gerard Casey, I think. He said, now, I don't believe, he's a libertarian anarchist, and he said, now, he's a Christian, a Catholic, and he says, I believe in the fallenness of man. If we got rid of, the monopoly state, we wouldn't, suddenly everyone wouldn't be like angels or something, right? It's not a utopian perspective, this anarchist perspective. What he says is that there would still be man's inhumanity to man. Men would still do bad things, but it wouldn't be, and maybe he used the word, maybe that's where I picked it up, it wouldn't be amplified by the state, right? So the state acts as a dramatic amplifier of, I would say, evil. And instead of, a few people off in a corner being into some weird thing, suddenly they use the state, and now we're all dealing with it, right? So I think the state is, in other words, let's not overstate the role of the state. Let's not exaggerate it. It isn't like the source of all evil, like the state is Satan embodied or something, or evil embodied. As Solzhenitsyn said, evil is in our heart. The line between good and evil goes right through our hearts, each individual heart, right? But the state amplifies the evil that's there, institutionalizes it, legislates it, makes it part of the fabric around us, makes it hard to avoid, even if we want to avoid it. Okay, so now let's turn then to my friend Academic Agent. He has a talk he gave at the UK Skildings event. Skildings? I don't know. We better learn how to say this since we keep doing more of them. He gave a talk at the UK event last fall, and it's called "Culture is Downstream from Law." It's really saying a lot of the same things Paul Gottfried is saying, but I thought there were some points worth calling out. He uses the U.S. as an example, mostly, and talks about in particular the role of the Supreme Court. In November 1980, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the Ten Commandments could not be posted on the wall of a schoolroom in Kentucky because seeing the words of the Mosaic Law on the wall may induce children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate, and to obey the commandments. And that can't be allowed because of separation of church and state or something, which actually is not part of the U.S. Constitution, but has effectively been put into the law through the Supreme Court. That rule reigns despite it never being, voted on, passed as an amendment or something like that. And then AA goes on to say, but that decision in 80 was predicated on an earlier decision, 63, which in turn went back to a decision in 62 that made it unconstitutional to compose prayer in public schools. I remember my father, a pastor, talking about the 62 decision and feeling like it had a huge impact on the country. And then, AA suggests when you effectively ban religion and the Ten Commandments from schools, maybe it has an effect on the culture, right? So in America, for those outside of the U.S., the Supreme Court is a method of de facto passing new legislation without actually passing new legislation by elected officials. The court members can decide a case by interpreting the Constitution, which means, essentially, they can make it up, since anyone with verbal dexterity can argue that black says white and white says black. In other words, the Supreme Court is simply a method by which elites can bypass the public. And that is what has happened again and again. And Academic Agent introduces this phrase from Kerry Bolton, revolution from above. So AA suggests that the decline in religious belief since 1962 can be, at least in part, attributed to legal changes. Okay, so the law is made, and then the culture reacts to that legal change, right? Now, Academic Agent also talks about the way that desegregation was done. And, you can observe how it happened, even if you think, desegregation was great or something. Let's just note how this was done. Again, in 1962, James Meredith versus University of Mississippi, and the Supreme Court basically forced the university to take their first black student. Now, on the ground, this was not what was wanted in Mississippi or at the university. There were riots, but the federal government just said it's going to happen, and so the federal state forced an institution to take a student against its will. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is that is against freedom of association, right? Maybe you think that, black and white people should be forced to associate, but there's other sorts of associations that you might like to have the freedom to do. And once this principle was broken, that people didn't have freedom of association, well, the door was open to forcing all kinds of unfortunate situations. And now, as we've all been talking about, even on children, right? Putting children in unsafe situations, I think. Then in the wake of JFK's being assassinated, the Civil Rights Act was passed by Lyndon Johnson in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. This had huge consequences. Let me quote from Academic Agent here. Civil rights ideology, especially when it hardened into a body of legislation, became most unexpectedly the model for an entire new system of constantly churning political reform. So let me pause in quoting here. What's the point? The point is, let's say you look back and you say, well, some of these changes were good changes. Okay, but the way they were done put in an institutional mechanism which just has continued until now. They're starting to make changes that maybe you don't like so much, right? Definitions of what was required in the name of justice and humanity broadened. Racial integration turned into the all-embracing ideology of diversity. Women's liberation moved on to a reconsideration of what it meant to be a woman, and eventually what it means to be a man. Immigration became grounds for reconsidering whether an American owed his primary allegiance to his country, or whether other forms of belonging were more important. Anti-communist military adventures. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm quoting from Christopher Caldwell, this whole passage. Sorry. It's Academic Agent quoting Christopher Caldwell. Anti-communist military adventures gave way once communism began to collapse in 1989 to a role for the United States as the keeper of the whole world's peace, an enforcer of ethical codes for a new international order, which was sometimes called the global economy. More recently, you might have heard of the international rules-based order or something like that. They're all, just propaganda terms for what I prefer to call, the U.S. empire, the global American empire. Academic Agent calls it the empire of lies, which is catchy. So Academic Agent, after quoting Caldwell there, says, Caldwell's thesis is that the raft of changes brought under LBJ in 64 and 65 in every area of life, including immigration. I didn't mention that, the immigration, a huge change in immigration, amounted to a new constitution, and culture has been catching up to it ever since. So, in other words, the legal changes, the state made these changes back, almost 60 years ago, and the culture has been just catching up to the changes that had already been put in place back then, right? The new regime. And then he talks about how the changes, the formal legislation of 64 was preceded by a Supreme Court's case in 1954, so 10 years before that, where they made that a unanimous verdict that ordered the desegregation of all but one of America's schools. And what they had done, I hinted at this, what they had really done was to abolish freedom of association, the First Amendment right from this moment on, and therefore they rewrote the Constitution, right, by getting rid of freedom of association. Okay, so why have Americans become so shrill, Academic Agent asks, so eager to play the victim, so demanding of others for their rights today? It's because culture is downstream from law. That is, a whole apparatus, as Paul Gottfried talked about, a whole anti-discrimination apparatus was put into place. And so being a victim at one time probably was viewed as something you wanted to avoid. You wanted to avoid being seen as a victim, right? Well, now people clamor for it. They freak out if you try to take it away from them. If you say, I'm not sure that you are such a victim, they will go off on you, right? You are going to put my life in danger by not embracing my victim status, right? Well, there's legal benefits to being a victim under our new order, right? Okay, so another change that happened totally from the law were the cases like the Miranda rights case in 1966 and other similar cases that expanded the rights of criminals. So the government decided arbitrarily that methods of justice and punishment that had worked perfectly well were now outmoded, and that now hitherto untested methods involving such nonsense as compassion for criminals, the idea that society is chiefly to blame for crime, and so on, must be brought in. And as Thomas Sowell said, has documented carefully, none of this had really good results, but they just pressed on anyway. Because it wasn't driven by, right, this is the whole point of what I'm trying to do today. It wasn't driven by people on the ground going, oh, this is terrible, how things are working out. It was just some ideas, some interest group or something, got their ideas put into place. They got legislated. They changed how everything was working. In some cases, people said this is not working very well, where crime is going up and so on and so forth. Didn't matter. They just kept going, right? Because it wasn't a democratic kind of thing, right? It was just a top-down decision. In regards to Roe versus Wade, AA makes a really interesting point that the women were not very unhappy. In 1971, they took a survey. They asked them, has being a woman prevented me from doing some of the things I hope to do in life? And this is your acid test, right, for whether women feel oppressed, I guess, right, for being women. 7% said frequently, right? 12% said occasionally. But 79% of women said hardly ever. So the women were not on board with some radical changes. Well, took care of that with Roe versus Wade in 1973. Finally, there was a wedge issue. The elites could drive into the heart of the American family between husband and wife, between sister and sister, right? And then, of course, this had a big effect on birth, right? How many babies were born alive after 1973? It's because they changed the law, and that changed everything. So AA also briefly points out that this happened in the UK as well. He focuses on my country, and then briefly mentions, of course, Tony Blair. Got to get the Tony Blair hit in, which is that many changes were made. Peter Hitchens documents this in the Abolition of Britain, starting around the 60s. Many legal changes were made. In virtually every case, parallel laws to the ones that AA has been going through in the US were made in the UK, whether through precedent or legislation. Anything that was forgotten was passed speedily without debate in the Blair years, to the extent where he even set up a totally alien US-style Supreme Court in the UK, which, if you might remember, tried to end Brexit just by fiat, the way the US Supreme Court just says, no, we're changing it. We don't need votes. We don't need to, lobby senators. We're just going to say this is the new rule. Well, they tried that in the UK and it didn't fly, right? AA does discuss immigration. Let me discuss that briefly. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. This overturned the Immigration Act of 1924, which had set racial quotas to ensure the nation would remain majority European. The 1965 Act flipped that, and at the stroke of a pen, the nature and character of the nation was changed forever. So the combination of the 1924 Act and the Great Depression had legal immigration at around 40,000 people a year in the late 1930s. With the 1965 Act in place, on the other hand, in the 70s, it hit 450,000 a year. So let me say that again. In the late 1930s, about 40,000 immigrants. In the 70s, after the 65 Act, that went up by an order of magnitude to 500,000 a year, right? Then in the 1980s, 730,000 a year, 733,000 a year. In the 1990s, 900,000 a year. So it went from, the old, melting pot, American melting pot, right? A small number of people who really put the effort in, want to be in America for various reasons. They're really highly, strongly motivated to do it. They want to fit in. They come and they're adopted into the culture, right? In particular, they would often not teach their children the language that they came from. They'd be, no, we came to America. We want to be Americans. You're going to speak English. I'm not even going to teach you how to speak Greek or Spanish or whatever, That was very common back in those days. Now, we have, enough quantitative change becomes a qualitative change, right? Instead of that trickle of melting pot immigration, now we have mass immigration where people come and just want to basically transplant their culture. Why? Because, well, various reasons, but one is that they weren't so strongly motivated to come to America because they wanted to be American. There's legal benefits to coming to America. You can come here and you can be part of the welfare state and so on and so forth. So maybe you really don't care about America at all. You like what my friends like to call Gibbs, right? You like to just you're just coming to get some stuff handed to you from American taxpayers. And so, you don't really want to adopt this foreign culture. You want to come and you want to keep your culture, right? Makes sense, but the point is, whatever you think of that change of, the effects of mass immigration, this was just a legal change that was made. It wasn't that there was, a spontaneous uprising of Americans wishing that, we had nearly 1 million immigrants a year. Okay. Right, and then already mentioned this point, but AA says all you need for laws to be made are the vested interests of some portion of the elite minority, and you can get into diagnosing, which minorities were pushing for which things if you want. But the point is what I was saying earlier: the state is an amplifier, right? Whatever that minority is, they are not able to reign over the majority without the instrumentality of the state. Okay, so now, oh, and by the way, I should have marked it in the video description. It is this paper by AA, which I've just skimmed over. There's a lot more good stuff in there. It is available without charts and stuff, unfortunately, on Academic Agent Substack, which I really recommend to you. But it is a pay-for subscription. It's pretty modest thing to pay for. But probably if you're interested in Academic Agent's work, it's probably one of the best things you can do, because that's where he really gets sort of more scholarly. So it's really good, really good. I really recommend the work he does on Substack. I look forward to everything he publishes on there. Okay, so now let's turn to Michael Rectenwald. Interesting. He got upset with the way things were going. So Michael Rectenwald is a much feared figure on the right. Or a much feared type. But what's interesting about him is that he's not that. Michael Rectenwald is someone who was a leftist, very deep into, Foucault and various Marxist type literature, postmodern literature, really an expert in many of these areas. But he started getting upset with some of the political correctness. And so what is his handle on Twitter? I just used it, the anti-woke prof, right? I think it might have been anti-PC before that. I'm not sure. But anyway, he started putting things out about that he was observing at his university on Twitter under this pseudonym, anonymously, okay, about how he wasn't happy with some of the trends going on. And then they outed him and, tried to cancel him. And he didn't lose his job, but things got uncomfortable at the university there. And then we know the usual story arc, right? Which is that the leftist, where things have gone a little bit too far for their taste, comes along and tells the right how they should really be, and ends up contributing to the right being pulled to the left once again, right? Well, that's not what happened with Michael Rectenwald. He hit the books, and man, he went deep. He read Rothbard, he read Mises, he read all kinds of stuff, and he really had more like a Damascene conversion. So I really recommend Michael Rectenwald to you, his Twitter account. He's got a book called The Google Archipelago, playing off of Gulag Archipelago. The article I'm going to share here, the talk I'm going to share from, is from 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and it is drawing from some of that material in Google Archipelago. So if you find this sort of thing interesting, the role of big tech and the relationship of big tech to the state and its role in influencing our culture, then you'll get a lot more by looking at his book. But I just wanted to give you a taste here. Again, we point to big tech, but, well, okay, let me just go through his argument. Now, I'm going to skip around because this was in the wake of the 2020 election. And it was at the time of the 2020 election, November 7th, 2020. When was the election? Anyway, is right around the time right in the midst of the election. So it's called the Google election, but I'm not interested in the election so much, right? I'm interested in the ongoing role of big tech in promoting some of the trends we're seeing. So I'm going to skip a bit here, but what he says is all but leftists realize that big digital corporations like Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and others lean left and squelch opposing views to the point of creating an alternate reality. But few ask why they are apparently leftist, let alone satisfactorily answering the question, to his satisfaction, that is, how are we to understand the blatant and well-documented leftist bias and the censorship of non-leftist views and sites by these companies? Why leftist? Is the internet leftist, or these big internet companies leftist merely because those in Silicon Valley have been indoctrinated into leftism? And should we adopt the view that since Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others are private enterprises, they can be as biased and censoring as they like? After all, aren't these private platforms and not public utilities, with no obligation to represent views with which they disagree? They are no more obliged to do so than I am obliged to allow some Antifa member into my home to spout their beliefs, right? Okay, so that's what he's going to address, and he's going to take a strong position here. So first of all, a new term. I'm going to put it in the live chat because you have to kind of look at it to get what I'm going with here. Okay, I put that word in the live chat. Now, in a series of lectures entitled Security, Territory, Population, the postmodern theorist Michel Foucault introduced the term governmentality. This will make more sense in a moment. To refer to the distribution of state power to the population, or the transmission of governance to the governed. Foucault referred to the means by which the populace comes to govern itself as it adopts and personalizes the imperatives of the state, or how the governed adopt the mentality desired by the government. That is, govern mentality. Since you can't really hear a hyphen, I will just put that word in. Okay, right? Govern mentality. So that's how you remember that word, governmentality or governmentalities. Govern mentality. You're absorbing the mentality of how you're governed. So what would be an example of what Foucault had in mind? Rechtenwald suggests that masking and social distancing might be an instance of that, where we absorb what the government wants us to do, and then now on our own, without anyone standing over us, we are just going around wearing masks and keeping our social distance and so forth, right? So that'd be a modern example. Now, Rechtenwald is not going to use the term quite that way, though. He adopts the term and amends it to include the distribution of state power to extra-governmental agents, in particular to the extension and transfer of state power to supposedly private enterprises. So this governmentalization of private enterprise, and not the privatization of government agencies and functions that leftists like Foucault himself decry, is the real problem with neoliberalism, right? Rechtenwald says, do they amount to the same thing? We are witnessing the governmentalization of private industry, the turning of supposedly private enterprises into state apparatuses, and the growth of the state through putatively private extensions of it. So whichever way you want to think about it, we're talking about corporations which on paper are private, but effectively are extensions of the government. And by effectively, I don't just mean they happen to share the views of the government and, hey, you can't blame them. They love Biden, right? Or, they're Democrats. That's just how they think. No. It's a little more, the relationship is a little more imposed, shall we say. So let's look into this. So consider government contractors that comprise the so-called shadow government. There's this documentary called Shadowgate, banned from YouTube after one day. And according to two whistleblowers who worked for military and intelligence contractors for many years, government contractors like Dynology, Global Strategies Group, Canadian Global Information, many others engage in intelligence projects that include something called Interactive Internet Activities, or IIA, Interactive Internet Activities. That's what we're doing right now, right? Social media, YouTube, Twitter, Google, so forth. So such social media psychological warfare and social media influence operations rely on masses of data that social media and other sources provide and are designed to influence individuals, groups, or populations to behave in ways desired by the deep state or other customers. So according to the Shadowgate whistleblowers, social media psychological warfare, which includes fake news, was initially developed for intelligence agencies, but has been used and sold by intelligence contractors independently. They claim that the whistleblowers here claim that social media psyops were employed in an attempt to tie Trump to Russia and discredit his campaign. Now that's really fun, right? Because the dominant narrative that the media was pushing for 4 years or more is that the internet was used, social media was used by Russia to benefit Trump's election. Okay. This is an example of my friend Binary Surfer's law, Binary's law, we call it. He says with the left, it's projection every time. That is, when they accused Trump of using social media, when they accused Trump of benefiting from social media influence under the dastardly influence of Putin back in, Russiagate and all this nonsense, what was really happening is that they had used social media to tie Trump to Russia and try to discredit his campaign, okay, using some of these techniques. Now, this gets spicy here. According to the Shadowgate whistleblowers, they also used these techniques to whip up the recent protests after the death of George Floyd, okay? So what does this have to do with Google and Facebook and so forth? Well, the interactive internet activities operations use and mine their sites, apparently gaining immunity from fake news designations. That is, they're allowed to do stuff on there that would get most of us booted, right? If we tried it. And these platforms are not just passive participants in personal data mining, social media psychological warfare games, and social media influence operations. And how do we know? Because if we look at the inception, funding, and histories of these platforms, we find that they were tied into the deep state from the beginning. So there's more detail that I'm going to go over, but I'm going to try to give you a taste of it. But Michael Rectenwald, this was a lecture he gave a year and a half ago for the Mises Institute. I've pointed to the transcript of it, the article of it, so you can go through the details if you find these sorts of things interesting. Excuse me. Okay, so state and state-connected funding of Google and Facebook, for example. So both Google and Facebook receive startup capital, both directly and indirectly, from U.S. intelligence agencies. In the case of Facebook, the startup capital came through Palantir. If you've heard of Peter Thiel, that's his company, right? The startup capital came through Palantir, SL Partners, and Greylock Partners. These funding sources either received their funding from or were heavily involved in something called In-Q-Tel. That was created by the CIA in 1999, its own private sector venture capital investment firm, to fund promising startups that might create technologies useful for intelligence agencies. So the CIA goes out there and directly invests in technology. And I assume, like I said before, Piper calls the tune, right? If the CIA invests in you, I'm thinking there might be some strings attached. Call me paranoid. So in the case of Google, Google's connections with the intelligence community and military run deep. The relationships with DARPA officials yielded startup funding for Google, and direct funding from the intelligence community followed. The intelligence community saw on the internet unprecedented potential for data collection, and the upstart search engine venture represented a key to gathering it. So they were in on the ground floor with Google, right? And intelligence agency backers included In-Q-Tel itself, the CIA's investment company, right? Their investment came to light in 2005 when they sold their Google stock off, which at that point was worth $2.2 million. Probably early days of Google at that point. I don't remember the Google timeline, so. Okay, what else do I want to highlight here? So from its inception, Google was incubated, nurtured, and financed by interests that were directly affiliated or closely aligned with the U.S. military intelligence community, many of whom were embedded in the Pentagon Highlands Forum. Google technologies were developed largely in connection with the intelligence community and military, and they bear the earmarks of intelligence community and military interests. Like I said, if you're going to get a bunch of investment from these folks, they're going to influence things, and in this case, from the beginning, right? Google's contracts with the intelligence community have continued. These platforms and social media outfits fully cooperate with the intelligence community and military, handing over data to the NSA upon demand and granting backdoor access to user data. You might remember, so Google was a deep state asset from its inception and remains one to this day. You might remember, at least at one point, I don't know where, I haven't been following the story, at least at one point, Apple was a bit resistant. They wanted them to give them something on a mass shooter or something, and Apple said, no, privacy is our selling point here, and we're not going to give this away to you, you know. So they actually were resisting being used, and the point here is, and maybe they don't anymore, I don't know, but Google and Facebook were the very opposite of resisting, shall we say. They've been essentially integrated with the deep state from the beginning. Okay, so former intelligence community contractor Patrick Bursey alleges that social media psychological warfare tools that he developed for the Defense Department were acquired, possibly illegally, by General James Jones, formerly the NSA formerly the National Security Advisor under Obama. In partnership with the Atlantic Council, where Jones is now the executive chairman emeritus, Facebook, Bursey alleges, is using social media psychological warfare tools, supposedly for the purposes of restoring election integrity worldwide and to combat election-related propaganda and misinformation from proliferating on its service. So in short, Google, Facebook, and a number of other technology companies are not strictly private sector entities. They're governmentalities in the sense that Rechtenwald has defined the term. They're extensions and apparatuses of the state. These platforms are governmentalities with a particular interest in the growth and extension of governmentality itself. And this includes, and here's where it comes home, right? This includes championing every kind of subordinated and newly created identity class that they can find or create, because such endangered categories require state acknowledgement and protection. And so the state's circumference continues to expand. So he's saying there's an interplay between, rules and laws that academic agent Paul Gottfried talked about, funding from the intelligence community, from the military-industrial complex, right? Funding, and then also the expansion of these victims, right? Because as you get more victims, they have to be protected by the state. These political victim classes, they have to be protected by the state, and so the state's power grows, and you've got this, vicious circle, I guess you could say, between designated political victim groups, governmentalities, and the state, where each are feeding into each other, right? To where at this point, I think we can see that the results are really quite terrible for the individuals caught in this. I'm thinking of people in the victim groups, right? So big digital is partial to the interests and growth of the state. It not only does business with statists, but it shares their values. This helps make sense of its leftist bent and the preference of the digital platforms for the deep state Democrats. And you may know that with Biden in particular, this talk was given prior to Biden's administration starting. But as you may know, Biden's administration is absolutely populated with people from Facebook and stuff like that. It's all over the administration, folks like that. Okay, so I think that is mostly what I wanted to say today. I wanted to drive home the point that these things are not spontaneous, organic outgrowths of, people power. These changes we're experiencing, they are driven by interests, yes, but interests that wouldn't have nearly the influence that they have without the instrumentality of the state apparatus, which is turned to take these, minority, in some cases, super tiny minority interests, right? Less than 1% of the population ends up establishing rules that we all have to live under. And of course, as the thumbnail suggests, has made it kind of a terrifying place to live in a lot of ways, right? You're afraid of getting fired. You're afraid of getting kicked off YouTube. It's not a wonderful world that has been created by all this. Okay, so let me just check for chats. Okay. Okay, yeah, I think we just have the one super chat. Oh, wait. Oh, great. All right, we have, is this a new supporter or something? I don't know who this is. Anyway, 2 chats from Stitzgatic Lemur. Okay. I don't even know what that word is. Might have to look it up. Okay. He says, I think besides the political, cultural, historical backgrounds of wokeness, metaphysics also takes a role in how woke think, what shapes it, in how woke think, what shapes identity and culture. For instance, gender identity, argued by the woke, has metaphysical, anti-realist nominalism foundations. Yes, and but like I said, I've been feeling a little impatient with a little too much emphasis on that sort of thing, as if, a philosopher proposed an anti-realist or nominalist idea 300 years ago, and now we're where we are. Well, I'd like to connect the dots a little bit more, right? How did we go from someone having an idea somewhere to we're all suffering under it? And I think that's sort of what I'm trying to get at with the show today, is that the state is not solely responsible, but it's a big piece of the puzzle and it shouldn't be neglected. Another one from Stitzgatic Lemur, thank you so much. Rechtenwald encountered the left singularity. I suppose if leftism just stagnated to only Marxist thought, Rechtenwald would still be a leftist. Well, right. I mean, it'd be interesting. I might have him on sometime. I've met him. It might be interesting to have him reflect a little bit. What was it that woke him up? Would he still be a happy leftist if things were a little more static and didn't just keep going? But of course, that's, in a way, as annoying it is, that's sort of something we've got on our side, right? Like I said, there's a vicious cycle that keeps going, and more people, I think, see it and don't like it, right? Okay, and then on YouTube, we have a very generous donation. Thank you from Mr. Monty Fontaine. If we ever achieve freedom of money, do you see that being a fatal blow to the big state? If not, by which other means could they retain this level of control? Thanks. Right, so I'm thinking of at least one friend who was on the show recently, who is bullish on, am I using the term right? Optimistic about the role of Bitcoin, that Bitcoin will catch on, that will take away something we talk about on this show a lot, the role of inflation of the money supply, expansion of the money supply in empowering the state to be at war, literal war, but also, as we've discussed today, war against us, right? War against its own people. Could Bitcoin put an end to that? Well, yes, it's possible. I think that the role of money is one of the big things you learn hanging out at the Mises Institute. The role of the Fed, the government's control of money, is not to be underestimated. Um, having said that, I don't know how likely it is. He didn't ask me, though. He just said, if we achieve freedom of money, do you see that being a fatal blow to the big state? Fatal? I don't know. I think it would put us into something more like an older situation. We wouldn't be dealing with the modern behemoth state. We might just be dealing with an annoying state of a couple hundred years ago or something, right? Which would be a huge advance from where we are right now. So I'm not like unhappy with that idea. Sounds good to me. Okay, so I think I've caught up on comments. And I will probably stop there. Let's see. I don't know what I'm doing next. I've been going a little bit intuitively, giving my graphic designer last minute ideas sometimes. But I do not lack for material. Let's put it that way. Oh, we have another comment. I'll address that in just a moment. I do not lack for material. I have a lot of guests that are ready to come on, that I'm excited about, and topics. And it's just a matter of, I don't know, the mood I'm in each week, I guess. Okay, so anti-commie comments in a super chat. Thank you. We won't have free money. There's powerful militarized institutions in the world are weaponized against you and only accept its currency bribes to stay away. Powerful military institutions of the world are weaponized against you and only accept its currency bribes to stay away. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm totally following. I guess he's talking about other, not the U.S. empire, but other militarized institutions that would be going after us. I'm not sure I totally follow that anti-commie. But by the way, I didn't go into it, but if you read, you might, if I think I know where you're going anti-commie. You might look at the end of Michael Rectenwald's talk, where he talks about the relationship of the big tech platforms to China. I'm not so sure about that, but see what he says, see what you think. Okay, so I think we're there, right? I'm going to do one last check for chats, and then thank you so much for joining me. And I will see you next week. Oh, wait. Yeah, next week. That's right. Oh, no, there is something to say. I have a guest appearance on Saturday. Lambda is doing something called Lamster. It's a, with permission, a play off of Millennial Woes annual wonderful event, which I got the pleasure to be part of for Christmas 2021, this last Christmas. Lambda is doing something around Easter. So Lamster, it's Lambda plus Easter, right? Lamster. And that's already been going. Some great stuff happening there. And I will talk on Saturday about what Christians can learn from the right wing and what right wing can learn from Christians, or maybe it's what the church can learn. Anyway, something like that. What right wingers and Christians or the church can learn from each other. I have some good stuff to share, so I suggest tuning into that. Lambda has 2 channels. He has the Lambda Bible Studies channel, but that is really for Bible studies. So you'll want to look for his channel that's just called Lambda. And that'll be the thing to catch there. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I think we are done. And let's see if the credits work. Here we go.